In the distant centuries, when Sicily was ruled by feudal lords and forgotten by law, the land itself became a prison of silence. Villagers lived beneath the weight of hunger and fear, paying taxes to masters they never saw, and praying for safety that never came. Out of this endless struggle, men began to take justice into their own hands. They called themselves men of honor, guardians of the weak, though honor and violence often walked side by side. At first they were only protectors of the farms, guarding olive trees and vineyards from thieves. Yet with every favor they granted, the debt of loyalty grew. Protection turned into tribute, and soon the people no longer asked for help. They paid for it. The strong ruled the silent, and silence itself became the price of survival. In the villages, whispered names carried more power than the king's decrees, and a nod from a local boss meant more than a written law. Thus the Sicilian Brotherhood was born, not from greed, but from a promise twisted by time. They created their own code, where the law of men was replaced by the law of secrecy. And as years passed, the island learned to live with two rulers, one of crown and sword, and another, unseen, made of shadow and fear. Under the blazing Sicilian sun, men worked the same soil that had betrayed them for generations. The fields were rich, but never theirs. The fruits of their labor filled the tables of nobles who lived far away, while the farmers' families starved on crusts of bread. Taxes grew heavier each year, and the only law that reached the countryside was the whip. When cries for justice went unanswered, men began to create their own. At first it was simple: a neighbor guarding another's land, a group of men watching the harvest at night. But protection soon became business. A man who refused help found his barn burned or his mule missing. Villages began to whisper of those who ruled not by title, but by fear. Yet the people still called them men of respect. For many, they were the only shield against a world that had long forgotten them. And so the seed of the Mafia took root in Sicilian soil, watered by poverty, nourished by silence. Each favor carried a price, each promise bound by loyalty. Justice and crime became one, and no man could tell where the boundary lay. In the stillness of the fields, the new rulers were not crowned by gold, but by the fear that lived in every heart. Long before the world learned the word mafia, the men of Sicily lived by laws no paper ever carried. Their code was simple, but absolute. Honor was the breath of a man, loyalty his blood, and silence his armor. To betray a secret was to die. To question an order was to vanish. In that silence, the organization grew strong, bound tighter than family, stronger than the state itself. Initiation was not given, it was earned. A man would stand before his brothers in the dim light of a candle, prick his finger, and let a drop of blood fall upon a holy card. As the flame consumed the image, he would swear eternal loyalty. His word would become his life, and his silence his protection. From that moment, he no longer belonged to himself. He belonged to the family. Outside their circle, the world believed in law and faith. Inside, there was only the oath. Disobedience was worse than sin. Betrayal, unforgivable. Those who lived within the code spoke little, trusted few, and feared none. Their power came not from armies, but from whispers, and from the sacred rule that had no name, yet governed all. Omerta, the silence that kept the shadows alive. As the years turned, the Brotherhood learned a hard truth: power lasts when it is quiet. They left the open road for back rooms, met at night in kitchens and cellars, and spoke in low tones. A nod could move a harvest. A handshake could decide a court case. The mayor heard their wishes before the town did. Soon people learned there were two doors to every office, one for the public and one for the men who came after dark. They built order where the state was weak. Debts were counted, quarrels were settled, and promises were kept, by fear if not by grace. Merchants paid for peace and they received it. Thieves avoided certain streets. Ships were loaded on time. In return, the family took a share of every trade, every vote, every chance that touched the market or the port. The law came late, and often it bowed on the way in. By then the island carried two governments. One waved flags and held parades. The other owned silence. In that silence, power grew like a deep root, hidden from the sun, yet strong enough to hold when storms came in from the sea. By the late 19th century, Sicily's earth no longer grew only wheat and olives. It grew wealth and danger. The mafia had moved from guarding fields to owning them. What began as protection had become taxation, and no man could harvest without paying tribute. Even the government's tax collectors learned to collect through the local bosses. Between the farmer and the state, the mafia stood as the middle law, and both sides feared them. Olive oil, the island's black gold, filled ships bound for the mainland, but every drop passed through their hands. A share for safety, a share for silence, a share for the men who made the rules. Behind every full barrel lay a trail of threats and broken promises. Those who refused to pay found their groves burned by night, their oxen dead by dawn. The soil itself seemed to whisper obedience. The people accepted it because peace, even false peace, was better than chaos. Merchants called it business. Politicians called it order. But in truth, the island had been sold, not to kings or nations, but to fear itself. And so, under the sun that once gave life, the fields of Sicily turned red, watered by the blood of those who dared to stand alone. As the 19th century advanced, Sicily changed its shape. Ports grew busy, streets spread like vines, and money moved faster than rumor. The brotherhood followed the flow. Men who once watched olive groves now watched warehouses, markets, and docks. In the city, fear did not wear a knife at the belt. It wore a ledger, a nod at the gate, a signature on a receipt, and ownership drifted from one hand to another. Shopkeepers learned the new rule. Peace had a price. Pay it, and crates arrived unbroken. Refuse, and a fire found your back room before dawn. Police patrols marched by in polished boots, but their eyes slid over certain doors. In taverns lit by gaslight, a glass was raised, a name was spoken softly, and contracts were settled without court or judge. Thus the family changed its breath. It traded the heat of the fields for the slow pulse of commerce. Stevedores, carters, clerks, and notaries all touched the same web. The city did not shout, it whispered. Beneath that whisper, money moved like a tide, lifting boats and drowning few who tried to stand against it. By the turn of the century, the family had learned a truth older than blood. Money buys soldiers, but influence buys peace. They began to look beyond the alleys and markets, toward the grand halls of politics. Votes became a new currency, and the mafia learned how to spend them well. A candidate backed by their blessing could not lose. One who opposed them could not walk safely through his own streets. It started quietly. A few favors during elections, a handful of loyal men guarding the ballot boxes, a whispered promise to deliver votes. In return came protection, contracts, and silence from the police. Power began to flow both ways. The politician gained his seat, and the family gained the law's blind eye. In Sicily, it became hard to tell who served whom. By the 1920s, their reach had grown so deep that a mayor, a judge, even a priest might owe his comfort to a man who never showed his face in daylight. Meetings were held behind curtains, deals sealed with wine and handshakes. And so, crime became governance, and governance became business. In the shadow of respectability, the old code still ruled. Loyalty first, silence always, and no mercy for betrayal. When Benito Mussolini rose to power, he promised to crush every secret force that challenged his rule. His voice thundered across Italy, declaring that only the state could hold authority. To him, the Mafia was not just a criminal brotherhood. It was an insult to the fascist dream of control. And so began a war fought in silence, a shadow battle between the dictator and the old Sicilian families. He sent his iron hand to the island. Prefect Cesare Mori, known later as the Iron Prefect. Mori's men swept through villages, kicking down doors and dragging suspects from their homes. Families that had ruled towns for generations vanished overnight. The prisons overflowed, and the countryside fell quiet for the first time in memory. Mussolini boasted that he had destroyed the Mafia, that his word was now law, even in Sicily. But shadows do not die. They wait. When war returned to Europe and Mussolini's empire began to crumble, the survivors of Mori's purge crept back from hiding. Many had fled to America and returned with new skills, new money, and old grudges. They had learned that power could be killed, but not fear, and fear was their true weapon. When the dictator fell, the Mafia smiled in silence, for their enemy had done them one final favor. He had taught them how to survive extinction. When the guns of World War II fell silent, Sicily was left in ruins. Cities burned, governments collapsed, and the people turned once again to whoever could offer safety. The Allied soldiers who landed on the island found chaos, and in their search for order, they looked to men who already had it, the old Sicilian bosses. Some were freed from prison with the stroke of a pen, others welcomed back as local leaders. In a single season, the Mafia rose from ashes to authority. They called it peace, but it was only silence. The families returned to their villages, rebuilt their networks, and opened their hands to new opportunities. Black markets bloomed under the soldiers' noses. Smuggling became industry. Grain, fuel, and even stolen relief supplies passed through their control. For every ton that reached the poor, another filled the pockets of the powerful. When the Italian state tried to return, it found its place already taken. Mayors, police chiefs, and businessmen owed favors to men who never ran for office. The Allies had reawakened what Mussolini thought he'd buried. Now, the Mafia was stronger, more cautious, more international, and better connected than ever before. Beneath the banner of liberation, a darker empire had quietly returned, dressed in the language of survival. By the 1950s, the Sicilian Mafia had discovered a new kind of wealth, one that did not grow from the earth but from addiction. It began quietly, with a few shipments hidden in barrels of olive oil, bound for the ports of America. The world called it heroin, but the men of the family called it white gold. It was light, profitable, and deadly, and it changed everything. The network stretched across oceans. Laboratories appeared in the hills, disguised as farms. The American Cosa Nostra handled distribution, while Sicilian chemists refined the product in secret. Money poured in faster than it could be counted. Entire villages that once survived on olives now lived on powder. With each deal, the family's reach grew, and so did its appetite. But power never comes without blood. Disputes turned to executions. Old allies became enemies overnight. Those who wanted to stay clean were silenced or buried. In smoky rooms, bosses toasted their success with trembling hands, knowing that each shipment carried both profit and doom. The island grew rich in fear, and the law grew quiet in exchange for a share. By the end of the decade, the Mafia had become more than a Sicilian secret. It was a global empire, built on the ruin of human souls. The 1970s brought no peace to Sicily. Behind closed doors and narrow alleys, the Mafia began to devour itself. The families that once shared power could no longer share profit. The rise of heroin money turned loyalty into suspicion and friendship into a weapon. It began with whispers, a name crossed out, a missing man, and soon the island bled openly. Palermo became a chessboard of death, where every move ended in gunfire. The Corleone clan, led by cold and patient men, rose from the countryside with a single purpose: domination. They believed fear was cleaner than negotiation. Their enemies were hunted in homes, cars, and restaurants. The streets echoed with the roar of bombs, the wails of widows, and the silence of witnesses who dared not speak. The old bosses, once untouchable, fell one by one. For the people, it was a season of funerals and shadows. Each morning began with rumors. Each night ended with a name missing from the list of the living. The Mafia had turned inward, feeding on its own. What began as a code of honor had become a battlefield ruled by terror. And through it all, the island watched in fear, waiting for someone or something to end the madness. For centuries, Sicily had lived under a single rule: never speak. The Mafia called it omerta, a word older than law, heavier than fear. It meant loyalty above life, silence above truth. No man could betray the family and expect to breathe another dawn. Mothers taught their sons not to see, neighbors pretended not to hear, and even priests avoided certain confessions. In Sicily, survival had a voice, and that voice said nothing. When the police asked questions, the streets answered with silence. Witnesses vanished, files turned cold. Those who broke the code met quiet, certain ends. A bullet in the dark, a grave without a name. Even the brave ones who tried to speak found themselves hunted, not only by killers, but by a society that feared their courage. Betrayal was contagious, and fear spread faster than truth. Yet, in the cracks of that silence, pain began to whisper. A few men and women, widows, sons, forgotten friends, found the strength to testify. Their words shook the walls of the courts, but each sentence came at a price: exile, loneliness, or death. Omerta remained unbroken for most, not because they loved the Mafia, but because they had learned that silence was safer than justice. And so the island continued to weep, not for guilt, but for the endless weight of its own fear. By the 1980s, Sicily had grown tired of fear. The bombings, the killings, the silence, it all weighed too heavily. Then came two men who refused to bow, Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino. They were judges, but more than that, they were believers, men who thought truth could live again in a place that had buried it long ago. Working side by side in Palermo, they studied the hidden ledgers, traced the blood money, and listened to those few who dared to speak. Piece by piece, they built the first real map of the Mafia's empire. In 1986, their work became history, the Maxi trial. Hundreds of Mafia members sat behind bars, accused together for the first time. The courtroom was built like a fortress, guarded by soldiers, filled with silence and defiance. The verdicts thundered across Italy, guilty after guilty after guilty. For the first time, the island dared to hope, but hope is fragile where the Mafia breathes. In 1992, a bomb tore through the highway near Palermo, killing Falcone, his wife, and his guards. Weeks later, another explosion took Borsellino. The country froze in grief. Yet their deaths did what no trial could. They made the people see. The judges had fallen, but the silence had cracked forever. Their courage had taught Sicily that even in a land of shadows, truth could still burn. When the blood of the old wars dried, the Mafia learned a new lesson. Power hides best behind respectability. No more gunfire in the streets, no more open threats. The world was watching now, and the family had to change its face. The new generation traded bullets for business suits, farms for banks, and meetings in dark alleys for offices lined with marble. The violence faded, but the control only deepened. They entered the legal world quietly. Construction, transport, waste management, and later, finance. Dirty money flowed through clean hands, washed in contracts and investments. Politicians smiled in photographs beside men whose names had once been whispered in fear. The line between crime and enterprise blurred until it almost disappeared. The new bosses didn't need guns. They had accountants. They didn't demand loyalty with blood. They bought it with shares and silence. From Palermo to Milan, their influence spread like a hidden current beneath the surface of modern Italy. Few saw it, but everyone felt it. Those who asked too many questions lost their positions, their homes, or their peace. The Mafia no longer ruled by terror alone. It ruled by presence, quiet and invisible, woven into the very fabric of the nation's economy. The old code remained. Power is silence, and silence never dies. The 21st century arrived with cameras, satellites, and laws sharper than ever. Yet the Mafia remained, changed, but not gone. It no longer ruled the villages with knives or ruled the ports with guns. It ruled through invisibility. The old faces had vanished, replaced by men in tailored suits, men who signed papers instead of orders, men whose crimes hid in spreadsheets instead of alleys. They learned that the world no longer feared bullets. It feared bankruptcy. The new battlefield was the digital one. Offshore accounts, shell companies, and silent investments replaced the language of violence. The web became their ally, the market their weapon. The Sicilian clans joined global networks that moved money faster than justice could follow. They built empires out of data and deception, keeping their old oath alive: loyalty, profit, and silence. But even in this new world, the past still breathes. The old villages whisper names from long ago, stories of men who ruled without crowns. Each generation believes it has tamed the beast, yet the shadow returns, quieter, cleverer, wearing the mask of respect. The mafia does not die. It evolves. It lives wherever fear and greed shake hands, wherever silence is bought, and wherever the night still listens.